EIA Administrator Tristan Abbey will present the key findings from the 2026 Annual Energy Outlook. Tristan Abbey was sworn in on September 25, 2025, as the 11th Administrator of the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Prior to joining the U.S. Department of Energy as a senior advisor in June of 2025, Mr. Abbey served as a distinguished fellow at the Energy Policy Research Foundation and a senior fellow at the National Center for Energy Analytics. Following Tristan's presentation, Malik Klein, the AEO product manager, will moderate a question and answer period. You can submit your questions at any time using the chat function in the Teams control panel. We also gathered questions during the registration and will incorporate those questions in today's presentation and Q&A. At this time, I'd like to turn over the presentation to the EIA Administrator, Tristan Abbey.
Thank you, Layla, and good afternoon to you all. Before I get started on our slides today, I want to go a little bit off script, and I want to read from the Administrator's Forward, which will be available on our website and as part of the AEO product. The report you are reading represents the highest standards of analytical rigor anywhere in the world and was produced by one of the hardest working, most dedicated teams in the federal government, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, or EIA. The Annual Energy Outlook is best understood as a product suite for alternative futures analysis, not a set of predictions. It includes this report, as well as the full set of data tables and visualizations, fully disclosed assumptions and methodologies, detailed descriptions of all 11 scenarios, 10 cases plus the counterfactual baseline, and the periodic retrospective, a marvelous innovation in transparency. We check our work, and you should feel free to do the same. The National Energy Modeling System, which forms the foundation of AEO 2026, is open source. All of its modules are fully documented. Everyone associated with this report's production deserves to be proud. That group may be centered on the AEO team, but the surrounding orbitals are heavily populated. There is only one EIA. Without the surveys and statistics of the National Energy Information System, there would be nothing to model. And without our data center and other technical resources, there would be nothing to run. EIA is undergoing a period of decisive acceleration that promises to leave no legacy system or antiquated process untouched. Our team has upgraded code, designed modules, and launched new surveys while improving efficiency and effectiveness across the agency. Artificial intelligence is a powerful enabler, but the will to renew is entirely human. Leading such a talented and capable group of people ranks among life's great honors. Now, back to the presentation. It is a privilege to present these findings from this year's analysis, given the extensive scope of the AEO, which encompasses 11 core cases and 15 detailed assumption reports and 200,000 data series and a comprehensive narrative. We cannot cover every aspect today. Please be aware that the complete AEO, including all the tables, charts, and full discussion of the findings, will be accessible on the EIA website immediately after this event, as well as a recording will be posted on the website. Next slide, please. The U.S. Energy Information Administration, or EIA, is the nation's premier source for independent and impartial energy information. As the Department of Energy's independent stats agency, EIA's job is simple but vital: to provide data and analysis in an unbiased way for everyone. EIA does not make policy. We inform it. By collecting, analyzing, and sharing information on everything from petroleum and natural gas to electricity and renewables, EIA empowers policymakers, markets, and the public to make data-driven decisions. Our independent work ensures that when we talk about energy, we're all starting from a shared set of facts. Today, we're here to talk about the AEO, the Annual Energy Outlook, which is the U.S. Energy Information Administration's cornerstone long-term and medium-term projection of our nation's energy future. The AEO serves as a vital data-driven reference point for policymakers, planners, and anyone seeking to understand the U.S. energy system. As a reminder, the AEO is a medium and long-term outlook. We recognize that current events are playing an outsized role in the near-term global energy markets. We're carefully monitoring these trends in the EIA Products Monthly Energy Review and the Short-Term Energy Outlook. If you want to know what's happening next month, you're in the wrong product. Next slide. To conduct analysis for the energy and the National Energy the Annual Energy Outlook, we use the National Energy Modeling System, or NEMS. This is a sophisticated suite that allows us to see how energy supply, consumption, trade, and prices shift based on economic, technical, and policy inputs. NEMS is open source and available on GitHub. Now, it's crucial to understand, and we emphasize this every year, that we don't predict the future in the AEO. Rather, we create a series of projections we call cases. Each case shows what could happen under a specific set of assumptions and methodologies, giving us a range of plausible and useful outcomes for America's energy system. For the cases listed on this next slide, please, we assume the laws and regulations on the books as of December 2025 never change. This year, we have focused on 7 core cases to explore the most significant uncertainties. We have our counterfactual baseline case, which was previously known as the reference case, along with cases for high and low macroeconomic growth, high and low oil and gas supply, and finally, high and low zero carbon technology costs. By analyzing the differences between these cases, we see the impact of these key drivers on our key indicators. Next slide, please. Going forward, I will refer to the counterfactual baseline as the CB case. You will also see that we have retired the high and low oil price cases this year to sharpen our focus on these other critical drivers. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to walk you through 4 additional cases we developed this year to explore some particularly timely uncertainties related to electricity consumption and alternative policies. These go beyond our 7 core cases from the prior slide and provide critical insight into emerging trends and potential policy shifts. First, the high electricity demand case. At EIA, we are eminently aware of the headlines about AI and the massive growth in data centers. In this case, we specifically modeled a future where the energy used by servers, particularly for AI, grows exponentially through 2050. This case, by design, has a more energy-intensive future for data center servers than in our CB case, allowing us to quantify the potential impacts on electricity generating capacity and generation if power demand from this subsector increases significantly more than in the CB case. Next, alternative electricity. Our counterfactual baseline incorporates the EPA's 2024 regulations for power plant emissions under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. The alternative electricity case assumes rule is not in place, and the affected generators no longer have federal restrictions on greenhouse gas emissions. In this case, existing coal-fired plants continue operating without requiring modifications to reduce emissions, and generation from new natural gas-fired combined cycle units isn't constrained based on whether the plant has installed carbon capture equipment. Similarly, we developed the alternative transportation case. This case examines the impact of removing the light and heavy-duty vehicle tailpipe greenhouse gas emission standards that were finalized in 2024. This case has significant effects on EV deployment, electricity consumption, and liquid fuel use. We'll touch on these themes throughout the presentation. Finally, we have the alternative electricity and transportation combination case, or the combo case. As the name implies, this case combines the previous 2 cases. It models a future where both policy changes are enacted. This case allows us to see the compounded effects of these 2 sets of assumptions. Next slide. Despite our projections for continued economic expansion under current laws and regulations, we see total U.S. energy consumption remaining relatively flat or even decreasing slightly from 2050 in most of our cases. This isn't a new phenomenon, but a continuation and acceleration of a long-term trend. You look back from 2000 to 2025, the U.S. economy grew at an annual average of 2.2%, yet total energy consumption decreased by 0.1% annually. The major driver here is efficiency. As we replace older equipment with more efficient technologies, we use less energy to produce the same goods and services. Our projections show this trend continuing, with consumption ranging from a slight decrease of 0.6% per year to essentially no growth in most scenarios. The only exceptions are our high economic growth and high oil and gas supply cases, where we see a modest annual increase. On the left, we have a bar chart illustrating energy consumption by fuel type across various cases. This chart allows us to compare the absolute consumption levels of different fuels, petroleum, gas, renewables, and others. On the right, the dot chart provides another perspective, showing the dynamic shifts in the shares of fuel consumption over time. This helps us visualize the relative growth or decline of each fuel source within the total energy mix, highlighting the changing proportions rather than just the raw volumes. Now, let's tie these visuals into one of the trends identified in this year's outlook, the future of liquids consumption, petroleum and other liquid fuels consumption. As you can see represented in these charts, a consistent finding across most of our cases is a projected decrease in total consumption of these liquids. We see a reduction of anywhere from 11% to 23% in 2050 compared to 2025 levels. This is a wide range. A substantial portion of this projected decrease is directly attributable to the increased adoption of electric vehicles. We'll talk more about this later. What these charts help to underscore is that even in cases where we model scenarios without the policies leading to further increases in vehicle efficiency, we still project a smaller but discernible decrease in petroleum and other liquids consumption. This suggests that market forces are at play. This move towards efficiency is also happening organically, driven by economics and evolving preferences, not solely by regulations. Next slide, please. One interesting observation is that the division of energy among sectors is projected to change in the future. In 2025, the pie is split roughly evenly with the transportation, industrial, and buildings sectors, including residential and commercial, each accounting for about a third of end-use consumption. But by 2050, we see a significant shift. The industrial sector's share of energy consumption grows to between 36% and 39%, driven largely by increased production in energy-intensive industries like bulk chemicals and the energy needed for oil and gas extraction. This growth comes as the transportation sector share shrinks, where the share drops to about 29% as the vehicle fleet becomes substantially more efficient across our cases. The combination case forms the upper bound of energy-related CO2 emissions across our cases, while the low oil and gas supply case forms the lower bound of CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. Turning to the transportation sector, there are a lot of interesting interactions between policy and economics here during this cycle. In the left-hand graph, you can see the 2050 final energy consumption for all transportation modes by case, with 2025 as the bottom row. Light duty and freight make up most of the energy consumed in transportation, followed by air and water. Across all cases, we project a clear trend. Decline in energy consumption for transportation compared to 2025, even with increasing travel demand. This is driven by the steady integration of more efficient vehicle powertrains into the fleet. We project transportation consumption to fall from 27 quads in 25 to a range of 21 to 25 quads by 2050. However, the analysis reveals that the magnitude of this trend is highly sensitive to policy assumptions. When we model the inclusion of the EPA's 2024 tailpipe standards, the result is a 13 to 25% decrease in fuel consumption by 2050. When we model the absence of these standards, the decrease is smaller at around 9%. Regulations are the key factor in the efficiency of new light-duty vehicles. On the right side, in the alternative transportation case, the domestic consumption of motor gasoline is about 2 million barrels per day higher in 2050 compared to our counterfactual baseline. By 2050, liquid fuels consumption is 3 million barrels per day higher in the alternative transportation case than in the counterfactual baseline, with 2.3 million barrels per day of the additional consumption as motor gasoline and 0.7 million barrels per day more as distillate. Next slide, please. Building on the last slide, regulatory assumptions are the key determinant of the projected adoption rate of electric and hydrogen-fueled vehicles in our analysis. The left graph shows battery electric vehicles as a fraction of all light-duty vehicles on the road. The right graph shows similar information for the heavy-duty fleet, including both battery, electric, and hydrogen-fueled vehicles. In all cases, other than the alt transportation case and the combination case, EVs make a substantial portion of all vehicles on the road by 2050. Specifically, electric vehicles grow to represent about 40 to 46% of all personal vehicles, and zero-emission models, both electric and hydrogen, account for 21 to 24% of all freight trucks. In the alternative cases that model the absence of the EPA standards, the resulting adoption is considerably lower. By 2050, electric vehicles comprise about 18% of the personal vehicle fleet, and zero-emission trucks make up only about 5% of the freight fleet. This latter case shows that without the standards, widespread adoption of zero-emission freight trucks is delayed until the 2040s, when projected battery cost reductions begin to make some electric models economically competitive on their own. Policy is a bigger driver of EV adoption than the higher gasoline prices seen in the low oil and gas supply case. Next slide, please. For 15 years, from 2005 to 2020, U.S. electricity demand was essentially flat. That era appears to be over. As you can see in the left-hand graph, in the last 5 years, we've seen consumption climb by over 2% annually, and our analysis shows this trend is set to continue, with electricity demand growing between 0.9% and 1.6% per year through 2050. These numbers may not seem huge, but they add up real fast. In the center graph, you can see that a major driver behind this new era of growth is the recent and projected computational demand from data centers, partially fueled by the artificial intelligence boom. In fact, we project that energy use in commercial buildings, where most data centers are located, will grow more rapidly than in any other sector across all our modeled cases. To understand the potential scale of this, we look at the high electricity demand case. In this case, we assume the exponential growth in AI servers continues through 2050, with efficiency gains lower than in the CB case. The results are striking. Under these assumptions, electricity consumption just for data center servers could grow to over 800 billion kilowatt hours by 2050. To put that figure in context, it's more than 16 times the server electric consumption in 2020. This growth is not just a national number. It has a distinct geography. As shown in the right-hand graph, this new electricity demand is concentrated in specific regions, particularly the South Atlantic and West-South Central Census divisions, which include states like Virginia and Texas, respectively. No coincidence that our new data center surveys are rolling out in Virginia and Texas. Next slide, please. To meet the rising electricity demand we just discussed, our nation's generating capacity will have to expand significantly by 50 to 90% by 2050, as shown in the left-hand graph, depending on the case. Our analysis consistently shows that this growth will be dominated by three resources: natural gas, solar, and wind. Combined, these three are projected to supply about 80% of total generation by 2050 in most scenarios, up from about 60% today. However, as shown in the right graph, the specific mix between these resources is highly sensitive to two key uncertainties: gas prices and renewable tech costs. At top of the right graph, you can see the 2025 mix with the 2050 generation mix shown for each case below it. Key colors are black for coal, red for nuclear, light blue for natural gas, dark blue for wind, and yellow for solar. Note that the black coal segments are larger than in the two cases with the alternate electricity policy assumptions. We project that between 100 and 125 gigawatts of coal capacity will retire by 2050 in most of our cases. However, in our alt electricity case, which assumes the absence of the 2024 power plant regulations, projected coal retirements are cut by nearly half to about 70 gigawatts, and coal's share of generation settles at around 5% instead of falling below 1%. Looking across cases, the new natural gas plants and new renewables are in tight cost competition. We see this most clearly with wind power. Our model shows over 5 times more wind capacity is added in the low oil and gas supply case compared to the high oil and gas supply case. The low case has a low natural gas supply and significantly higher natural gas price, leading to more wind additions. The rise of natural gas generation, natural gas price remains a key determinant of the overall cost of electricity across all scenarios. While the transition to a grid dominated by gas and renewables is a consistent trend across our cases, The specific mix is heavily influenced by market prices and regulatory policies. Next slide, please. Turning to natural gas, we project a future of significant growth in most cases, driven by increasing demand both at home and abroad. On production, we project dry gas output will rise from 107 billion cubic feet per day in 2025 to between 133 and 151 billion cubic feet per day by 2050 in most of our cases. The exceptions are our high and low oil and gas supply cases, which create a wider range. This rise in natural gas production is partly a result of a reassessment of underlying factors, including the gas-to-oil ratios for plays where natural gas is co-produced with crude oil. We have a short technical paper on this reassessment, as well as similar technical papers on model development affecting LNG and renewable energy generating capacity as part of the EIA 2026 available on the website. The largest production increases come from low-cost regions like the Appalachian Basin, with significant contributions also coming from areas rich in associated gas like the Permian. As production grows, consumption grows as well. As discussed on the prior slide, the electric power sector remains a key source of demand, with natural gas generation growing to meet rising electricity needs. In addition to domestic consumption, foreign demand remains strong, supporting growth in liquefied natural gas infrastructure and growing U.S. exports. U.S. exports of natural gas, specifically LNG, are the fastest growing source of demand across most cases and a primary driver of the production growth we are in the midst of a significant build-out. We project U.S. LNG export capacity to reach 27.7 BCF per day by 2030. Beyond that, we project it will be economical to build additional capacity, resulting in export volumes ranging from 29.6 to 37.9 BCF per day by 2050 in most cases. Our projections reflect higher priced international natural gas, which makes U.S. LNG more competitive. The only exception to this export growth is our low oil and gas supply case, where high domestic prices would make U.S. LNG uncompetitive, leading to our export facilities being utilized at less than half their capacity by 2030. Next slide, please. Look at the graph on the left, U.S. oil production. We project that U.S. crude oil production will remain relatively stable through 2050 in most cases, hovering between 12.4 and 12.8 million barrels per day in 2050, down from 13.6 million barrels per day in 2025. This stability comes despite modest increases in Brent crude oil prices and the dwindling prime drilling acreage in key shale plays. The Permian Basin remains the dominant force in lower 48 onshore crude oil output, accounting for between 54 and 64% of production. You'll notice this significant range defined by our high and low oil and gas supply cases. The high case showing a distinct increase, especially after 2035, reaching 18.7 million barrels per day, while the low case projects a decline of 6.4 million barrels per day by 2050. In the middle graph, we see the projections for U.S. crude oil exports. We anticipate the U.S. to remain a net exporter of petroleum through 2050 in almost all of our cases. Crude oil exports are projected to be level, generally staying between 3.3 million and 4.7 million barrels per day. This translates to roughly 25 to 33% of total U.S. crude oil production being exported by 2050, underpinned by an assumption of continued global liquid fuels demand growth. However, the low oil and gas supply case presents a stark contrast where low production volumes lead to crude oil exports falling to 0.2 million barrels per day by 2030 and then to zero by 2050, resulting in significant net imports. In the alternative transportation case in pink, higher domestic consumption means more crude is refined domestically, reducing the percentage of crude supplied for export. Finally, on the right, we examine petroleum liquid exports, which include domestically refined products like gasoline, diesel, and hydrocarbon gas liquids, or HGLs. We project an increase in these exports across nearly all cases. This growth is primarily driven by the rising production of hydrocarbon gas liquids, which is closely tied to our projected increases in natural gas output. In fact, we anticipate that between 37 and 71% of domestic HGL production will be exported. The high oil and gas supply case particularly highlights this trend, where HGL production outpaces domestic demand, making exports the primary outlet for the increased supply. The only exception to this upward trend is, again, the low oil and gas supply case, where both HGL production and exports decline. It's also worth noting that in the alt transportation case, where domestic demand for liquid fuels is higher, we see lower petroleum product exports. Next slide, please. Our projections for nuclear capacity remain flat across most of our cases. Of the cases that we consider here, nuclear power generation increases meaningfully in the low oil and gas supply case, where the price of natural gas rises enough to make new nuclear generation economical in the 2040s. The type of nuclear power considered by the model is based on representative designs for both large and small-scale light water reactors. The National Energy Modeling System, NEMS, is not optimized to project the economic competitiveness of technologies still experimental or undergoing development, such as other types of small modular reactors. These are the SMRs we hear often about, microreactors, and fusion. This apparent discrepancy comes down to our core methodology surrounding policies and economics. The greater the specificity that can be provided to the model as an input, the more easily NEMS can solve for future pathways. At the time of publication, that is today, DOE and other agencies are still reviewing and developing projects and support mechanisms for both near-term commercial projects to meet the 2030 goal and longer-term policies to support the 2050 goal. As of our December 2025 cutoff for this outlook, many of the initiatives to support nuclear energy were still in development, without the finalized rules needed for inclusion in our model. The story is similar on geothermal. Next slide. Again, it is a privilege to present the principal findings from this year's analysis. Please be aware that the complete AEO, including all data tables, charts, findings, will be accessible on the EI website immediately after this event, as will a recording be posted on the website also. Thank you, and with that, I'll hand the stage off to Mala Klein, the product manager for the AEO, and a panel of esteemed EIA experts.
So we have Stephen York for oil and gas. Thanks. Michael Dwyer for demand. Nina Vincent for electricity. Kevin Nacklin for macro emissions. Great, thank you all. And so as a reminder for those of you that are on the call, you can type your questions into the chat using the Q&A function. So again, we'll just add those in as we go. But before we get to the questions from our audience, I wanted to get each panelist's take on this year's AEO. So my first question for all of you is, what did you find most interesting or surprising this AEO? And we'll go ahead and start off with Stephen. Stephen, what did you think?
Yeah, thanks. I think the thing I found most interesting this AEO was for natural gas, the amount of natural gas infrastructure being built. There's, of course, LNG export capacity that we project will more than double by over the next couple of decades. But the thing that's less talked about, but is equally as important, is the amount of natural gas pipeline infrastructure being built out. With all that natural gas or LNG capacity being added to the Gulf Coast, that's adding a lot of potential LNG or natural gas demand there. So much so that we're projecting that nearby production formations such as Permian and the Haynesville will struggle to meet that LNG export demand, in addition to the end-use sectoral demand in that region. So we're finding that it's most economic and necessary to build out large amounts of natural gas pipeline takeaway capacity from the Appalachia to the Gulf Coast in order to help satisfy that added LNG demand. And ultimately, it means, in the future, we could see more, natural gas from Appalachia being exported as LNG exports from the Gulf. So I find that pretty fascinating.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. All right, Nina, same question to you.
So it's interesting that we project renewable technologies like wind and solar build some capacity after federal tax credits expire. In most cases, the majority of new utility scale capacity is natural gas, with a smaller amount of wind and solar. But with the cost declines of wind and solar in the past few decades, they're still somewhat competitive compared to conventional dispatchable technologies after their tax credits expire to meet increased electricity demand over the years. For AO 2026, we assume that under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act of 2020, tax credits for wind and solar expire for facilities starting service after 2028 and 2029. After these years, wind continues a steady build of capacity in most cases, and solar builds a significant amount of utility scale capacity right before the credits expire, then flatlines, but later continues some capacity growth by 2050.
Great, thanks, Nina. All right, Kevin, on to you. What did you think?
I thought one of the most interesting aspects of AEO 2026 was the impact of policy assumptions on our projections. And I think that the alternative policy cases that we presented for AEO 2026 are excellent examples of that. So to provide a little bit of background, at least for those that are maybe new to the AEO or maybe are not familiar with some of our cases, most of our cases assume current laws and regulations. Our alternative policy cases let us adjust or remove some of these policies to see what the energy future might look like without some of these policy assumptions. And I think that the alternative policy cases are particularly interesting in this capacity because while that's kind of mechanically a small change, it can lead to some pretty significant changes in some of our projections, which were demonstrated during the presentation before. So really interesting stuff worth taking a look at if you're flipping through our tables.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. All right, Michael, last but not least, what did you find most interesting or surprising this AEO?
Yeah, sure. I'm a transportation guy, so transportation related. But something that was interesting to me is, and Tristan touched on this a bit in his presentation, and I guess actually Kevin too just now, but the impact of policy on EV adoption is significant. Removing those major EV encouraging policies in the alternative transportation case significantly slows EV adoption, right? By 2050, as you saw in the chart, there's less than a third as many EVs registered in the US in that alt transportation case versus the CB. Perhaps not surprising to some, surprising to others, but I think it's interesting to note that EVs don't just disappear when the policies are removed. Continued rollout of EV infrastructure, declining battery costs, and availability and introduction of EVs in new market segments where they don't currently exist ends up leading to continued growth in electrification. After some fluctuation due to those policy changes in the mid to late 2020s, EV sales share does grow every year through 2050, even in the alt transportation case. I should say it's interesting to compare this, if you get a chance in the tables, to what happens with freight truck electrification and hydrogen fuel cell adoption. Removal of policies in that mode pretty much eliminates adoption of electric and hydrogen powertrains entirely, aside from some electrification in the lighter classes. Happy to hear what you all think. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all for your answers to those questions. As Tristan alluded to, and each of you in some way or fashion mentioned, we have a lot that we publish online. So, for those that are just delving into our data and aren't as familiar with it, this might be a good way to get acquainted. And just as a reminder, because we did have a few questions come in, all of this will be posted to our website shortly after this webinar. And the recording of this webinar will be posted by tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that, and send it to your friends that might have missed this. So now I'd like to move on to our questions that we've gotten from the audience. And while I wait for questions to come through on the chat, I'll start with some of the ones that were received for participants that were able to register. So this first question is for Stephen. What are the price implications of long-term LNG export growth?
Yeah, that's actually something we have done quite a bit of in-depth analysis on. In summary, the results of our analysis found that higher LNG exports do lead to some natural gas price increases that are reflected in both the spot market and the in-use market. The magnitude of those price increases isn't necessarily very large, but it does depend on how much LNG export growth is added. But at the end of the day, when you add LNG exports, that is, adding LNG demand to our domestic sector, and that does put in some upward pricing pressure. For more information on this, I encourage people to look at our May 2023 Issue in Focus where we cover that topic a lot more in detailed, and we also kind of dive into the implications of what those price increases mean for the rest of the energy market.
Great, Stephen, thank you. All right, the next question I have is for Nina. Are you reflecting near-term supply constraints and capital cost increases on gas turbines?
Yeah, so we're reflecting capital cost increases due to recent supply shortages and tight markets for both materials and labor for combustion turbines. The increased capital cost values for AO 2026 were based primarily on the PJM cone study from SNL and Brattle. We adjusted our capital cost numbers by component based on this report from the original costs from SNL's 2024 capital cost report for EIA, resulting in about a 40% increase in simple cycle turbine costs and a 20% increase in combined cycle plant costs. Recently, other reports have indicated that turbine costs have grown even more, but we adjusted based on the knowledge we had at the time, and we'll update next outlook.
Great, thanks so much, Nina. All right, my next question is for Kevin. Are you reflecting tariffs in your capital costs or macroeconomic expectations?
Thanks, Paula. That's a great question. We do reflect tariffs in our macroeconomic expectations, but we don't do so explicitly. So to provide a little bit of context on that, our macroeconomic model does not explicitly represent tariff rates, but we do have a variable which is real tax on production and imports that does represent tariff collections. So the tariffs are represented in our macroeconomic expectations. Though I would say, to add a bit of a caveat to that, the tariffs that are modeled within our macroeconomic model are dated to August of 2025 when we received the S&P US macroeconomic model.
Great, thank you. And next question is for Mike. Historically, the AEO has underprojected annual U.S. gasoline consumption for many years. Have there been updates to the model for better estimates?
Sure, thanks, Mala. So and I think Tristan talked about this pretty well, and it's always good to just reemphasize some definitions here. So the AEO is not a prediction, so it's hard to say that it necessarily undershot gasoline consumption in any past edition. The AEO produces projections of energy supply and demand under a set of specific assumptions, right? So for that central case, the counterfactual baseline, formerly known as the reference, those assumptions include, first, current law and regulations are enforced and are met. Second, technology evolves. It does not, there are no revolutions in technology. And then third, there's no disruptive geopolitical events that we add to the projection in the future. There's no pandemics or any other uncertain developments of that kind incorporated into our projection. We develop and implement a wide range of side cases to explore beyond that set of specific assumptions, as Tristan noted in the presentation. So if, for instance, you think that maybe gasoline consumption is low in the CB and core side cases due to your assumption regarding EPA tailpipe GHG regulations, you might consider looking at the alt transportation case. It's the same NEMS model, different set of assumptions. Regarding the second part of the question, have there been updates to the model for better estimates? The model's under constant development. It's not a static set of code. Staff here work all year developing code in addition to analyzing policy and technology. So the NEMS model developed for AEO 2026 has been heavily modified and improved versus the model used for AEO 2025.
Great, thanks for that answer. And I actually have another one for you, Mike, so keep yourself unmuted. So EIA has previously represented data center energy demand as a share of commercial buildings' energy demand, rather than as a particular type of building or particular subsector. Is this still EIA's approach, or are there efforts to change how data center demand is modeled?
Sure, thanks. So you are correct that data center energy demand is accounted for in the commercial buildings demand sector. In past AEOs, data center servers were aggregated in with the computing end use in commercial buildings. But for AEO 2026, the buildings demand folks split data center servers out as a separate end use, enabling us to capture that variation in projected growth and operating parameters. So I guess, for example, we can now explore the trade-off between computational efficiency improvements and increasing data center service demand. We can look at how data centers have more intensive use of space cooling and ventilation, and how stock turnover operates differently for data center servers. This new capability was leveraged to develop and now publish the high electricity demand side case. And if you have any other detailed questions on that, you can definitely look at the case descriptions document, or reach out to the buildings folks over here who work on that model.
Great, thanks, Michael. And, I always love a good plug to our site. We have a lot of materials on there, and case descriptions is just one of those great documents. All right, so this next question is for Kevin. Can you speak to the near term till 2035 CO2 emissions from total electric power generation? And how do the 2026 AEO results compare to the 2025 results for this metric? Lastly, how does the high electricity growth fare for these emissions?
All right, three-part question. Okay.
Yeah, let me know if you need me to repeat any of it.
So yeah, let me see. So breaking apart the first part. So I guess I will first start with a quick clarification that unlike, some other products that you might use, what we have for our emissions representation is strictly CO2 emissions. So we don't have CO2 equivalents for other gases there. So just a quick clarification that when you look at our CO2 emissions, you're looking at CO2 and not CO2 equivalent. What I would say generally, though, in terms of breaking that apart from our emissions results, out to 2035 from the electric power sector, you should see a relatively large decline in emissions, mostly as a result of retirements from coal power. How this compares to our 2025 outlook, even though we still see coal going down, coal retiring in both the 2025 outlook and the 2026 outlook, the emissions will be a little bit higher for 2026 since you no longer have, say, some of the production and investment tax credits for renewables. And so you see something like natural gas coming online instead. So emissions will be a little bit higher than if you were to use something like renewable power there. And for the last part of the question, for the high electricity demand case, the general emissions implications of that, you will see more emissions in that case as a result of more power coming online, and some of which coming from fossil fuels, but it's not one of our bounding cases for AEO 2026. So I think that's all three of them.
I think you covered them. Thank you for taking on that long question. I have one quick, easy one that I can take. Someone asked, are you no longer doing the high-low price of oil and natural gas in the AEO, or was that just not included in this webinar? So that is, we did not include that set of cases for this AEO. So you will not see that in our results or on our site. All right, so for our next question, this one is for Nina. How do you account for BESS in a continued investment of solar and wind?
So we have two types of battery storage technologies that we represent in NEMS. One is a solar battery hybrid technology, and one is a standalone battery technology. So it's represented on, we have a model that represents batteries on an hourly time scale, and if it ends up being economical, often paired with wind or solar technology, then it'll build more battery.
Great, thank you. All right, and I have one for Stephen. How speculative are the oil and gas production projections in AEO 2026?
So for our oil and gas projections for this AEO, there's a few key drivers that we have to make assumptions for that help, create our projections. One big one is our world oil price. That was decided and finalized back in the fall of 2025. So it obviously doesn't take into account any of the oil price volatility we've seen recently with the war with Iran. And so that obviously kind of changes sort of the short-term dynamics. So that's something to keep in mind when it comes to what assumptions we have to make in order to do our crude oil and natural gas projections. Another key driver that we have to make assumptions for is resource availability and drilling productivity and how that changes over time. While our counterfactual baseline case, we do account for increased productivity and technological learning over the course of our projection. We also have a high and low oil gas supply case where we make different assumptions for resource availability and productivity. So that way that sort of provides reasonable bounds to what those assumptions are to help people make a bit more informed sort of lessons learned from those side cases using different assumptions, and it just helps provide better bounds for us to use.
Great, thanks, Stephen. All right, and we have one last question that has come through, and that is for Nina. So which electricity generation technologies are most sensitive to higher or lower demand scenarios? In a high scenario, which technologies see most growth and which technologies see the biggest drop off in lower demand scenarios?
Sure. So this AO, we are only modeling a higher demand scenario. I'll compare that to the CB case, which is kind of the baseline. So the higher demand scenario generally builds more natural gas and wind capacity compared to the CB case. That's mostly it.
Great. Thank you so much, Nina. So thank you all so much for your answers. And then thanks to those of you online for all your questions. So with that, we'll be ending the Q&A. I'd like to remind everyone that the presentation you saw today, as well as the full narrative, data tables, assumptions, a number of the documents that were mentioned during this call and others that you associate with the AO are available on our websites, www.eia.gov/AEO. And thanks to Tristan, Layla, and the AO panelists on the screen. I'd also really like to thank all the EIA staff that have worked tirelessly to put this AEO 2026 together. You see a few of the folks on the screen, but there are many, many out here with us that did all of this work. So really appreciate it. And then finally, thank you to all of you that joined us today. And with that, this concludes our presentation.